And that's coming from a specific clause in the
Yes.
Constitution, right?
Yeah. So, but look, if you remember your history, what was the American Revolution about? It was about no taxation without representation. It was a tax
Mhm.
revolt.
Right.
So the first government that we had was called the Articles of Confederation, and they wanted to be really careful not to repeat the mistakes of King George. And so there wasn't going to be a mandatory tax coming from a faraway capital. So they actually made the taxes voluntary at the federal level. They said to each state, this is your share, please pay. And Bob, would you be shocked to know that when taxes are voluntary, people don't pay them? So the Articles of Confederation failed mostly because the federal government had no money.
Mhm.
The Constitutional Convention comes in, and they're basically trying to balance two things. And the first thing is, look, we really have to have representation if we're going to tax. And then the second is, but we have to do better than the Articles. So there have to be mandatory taxes. And the bargain that they struck was to say that most of the revenue was going to come from tariffs, import duties, excises, which is stuff made in the United States, and consumption taxes. And for those, Congress has the power to do it. And the only limit is it has to be uniform. So if they're going to tax the import of paper in Virginia, it has to be the same rate as the tax on the imported paper in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Georgia. So uniformity. But then they have this other thing called a direct tax, which I think is really, it's essentially a wealth tax. And for those, they have to be apportioned. And that's what we were talking about a minute ago. And it wasn't clear what an income tax was. Congress created an income tax during the Civil War. It was upheld. But then in the 1890s, they created a different income tax, and the Supreme Court struck it down. And so the Constitution was amended to say you could have an income tax without apportionment. And so that's why we've had an income tax since 1913, but not a wealth tax, because the amendment didn't allow a wealth tax.
Okay. 1913 was also the founding of the Federal Reserve. So a lot of people I know on the right do not like the year 1913. Okay. So thank you for that. And then is the reason, I'm just curious, is the reason the consumption tax was okay in their mind was that in a sense that was voluntary too?
Yes.
Like you could just choose not to drink the tea or whatever?
That is exactly what they said. They said it's less burdensome because people can choose how much they want to buy. Wealthy people are going to buy more. So it's even achieving this distributional goal. And the other thing they said is, and it's a Laffer curve point, and it's impressive that you see the Laffer curve discussed in the Federalist Papers in the 1780s. But they basically said, and there's a built-in limit on what the government can charge, because if the rate gets too high, they won't get any revenue because people will just stop buying.
Right.
The framers were much more comfortable with that and much more nervous about property taxes because you can't really avoid them. That's why they call them direct taxes in the Constitution.
Right.
If I'm alive and I own something, they can tax me, and there's nothing I can do about it. And there were some people who didn't want to include those taxes, but people like Alexander Hamilton said, no, we should include it. We should just make it subject to this apportionment requirement. And the main thing they were thinking about is wars. Because back then, if you were only taxing imports, well, we didn't have much of a navy. And during a war, there weren't going to be imports. So the government wasn't going to have any money.
Okay, great. All right, so that was a very interesting historical detour just to remind us of stuff that I think many of us like, oh yeah, I kind of remember that from 30 years ago. Should we talk about the Moore case specifically at this point? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
hey everybody, this is Bob Murphy. Thanks for listening to this clip from the InFi podcast. If you like what you heard and want to hear more, please consider subscribing and share this video with others. We've got new episodes dropping every Friday with more insightful discussions. Stay tuned.